So we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us. We first want to model some accessibility as part of our panel. And so asking you all to stay on mute unless you're speaking, that helps with background noise, as well as the recording and the captioning, which should be turned on. So folks, it doesn't pick up erroneous words or other people speaking. I'm Allison Larash, and I'll be moderating this panel as part of our friends from the World Club of Disability Advocacy, or the group within District 7910. I just want to first give a land acknowledgement. I'm coming from Wisconsin, where the Ho-Chunk and Menominee have their creation story, and I want to acknowledge the lands and my neighbors, the Ojibwe, who currently live in this space. In addition to staying on mute, we also will be giving visual descriptions of each of us, and we'll go around and introduce ourselves. I'm a white woman. My pronouns are she, her, and I have a physical disability. I'm a dwarf, or person with short stature, and I will pass it on to Jeremy.
Okay. I hate this question, but am I muted because I'm having difficulty?
You are not.
Good show. Thank you very much, Alison. My name is Jeremy Opperman. I'm residing currently in Cape Town, South Africa. So I'm probably one of the people furthest away. I identify he, his. I am blind. And what else can I say? I think that's about it, really. That's me.
Thanks, Jeremy. And on to Nate.
Hi, I'm Nate Johnson. I'm from the Athol Orange Rotary Club. I'm a white male, and I have a physical disability of cerebral palsy.
Thanks. And Victoria, our other panelist, is trying to join us. And so we'll have Jeremy get started and chat for a little bit, and then move on to our next panelists.
Thank you, Alison. Am I right? We have about 6, 7, 8 minutes. Is that right?
About 8 minutes, yeah.
Thank you.
And feel free, sorry, I should have said this. If folks want to put questions in the chat, I'll scan for those, and we'll have time at the end to answer them.
Good. So good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me all the way from South Africa. I'm a diversity practitioner. I have been so for the last 22 years. As I said in my intro, I am a blind person, although that blindness is not necessarily the reason I got into diversity. Diversity is a particularly important area, not only in my country, where we've had some very disruptive social problems from institutionalized racism and separation. So we have a lot of experience with diversity in our country, and I'm very passionate about an element of diversity which is not always incorporated within classical diversity, equity, and inclusive thinking, which is disability. And so I was appointed onto the Rotary International DEI Task Force in July 2021. And I'm very proud to be able to play a role in Rotary International's approach to DEI. So as DGE Victor outlined, Rotary is committed, and I won't go through everything he said, obviously, but Rotary is committed to taking that challenge of incorporating DEI more into its culture. The Rotary has a history of some exclusion in the past, and that's not a secret. And we know about the issue around women until about 40 years ago, etc. So this is a very important step that the Rotary Board made in 2020 to absolutely embrace the concept of DEI at all levels. In 2020, by 2021, early 2021, a process had already been established to put into place mechanisms that would ensure a sustained approach to DEI. So there were four basic elements that were created by the new DEI committee. And the first was external partners. And so a relationship was made with a verified, established external partner in the form of PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, who worked with the board on DEI training, and who also then provided several strategic approaches for Rotary to embrace DEI. And the first was a survey. Some of you may remember having been asked. 30,000 Rotarians around the world were surveyed to establish their understanding of DEI and where DEI fits into Rotary International. And the results of that were predictable, that clubs and districts and regions and zones very often are very similar in the sense that people tend to cluster together. There isn't necessarily as much diversity within clubs and districts as would possibly be required, or it would be good to have. But one of the most important illuminations of that survey was that persons with disabilities are excluded to a great degree amongst the Rotary family. In other words, there are very, very few, on average, persons with disabilities being represented in Rotary. And so this isn't something we made up. This is a verifiable fact. And I'm the only person with a disability in the DEI task force. And so my job is to ensure that we incorporate an approach that doesn't leave off, from my perspective, the disability element of diversity within the DEI framework. It's very easy because disability is something that we tend, in fact, to not necessarily pay attention to very often. Obviously, it depends on your country that you live in. And even within your country, there may be different areas. For instance, in a very urban area, it's very possible that you have particularly in America, where you have extremely accessible public transport and accessible features around the town. But if you go into the rural area, it's extremely possible that you might not have as much accessibility evident, particularly in the transport area. So that's an example. And so what the DEI task force has done is it's taken four categories, or rather four components that they tackle. The first, as I mentioned, was the external partnerships. That's working with people like PwC and others to assist in appropriate, informed DEI material, let's say. The second is policy. And policy is very important because an organization the size, with the historic background of Rotary, has an extraordinary amount of policy material. And it's very important to audit that policy to establish whether, in fact, it is, in fact, DEI friendly. And within the DEI context, is it disability friendly? And so there's a lot to be done on that. Then there's culture. Very importantly, it's important to establish what is the culture existent within Rotary, within zones, within districts, within clubs, around the attitude towards DEI, and to inform that culture and assist that culture in becoming more inclusive. From my perspective, one of the most important words in the DEI acronym is the I, inclusion. And so inclusion is vital, that we look around to ensure that we do in fact include those that we might not. As DGE Victor said earlier, the idea is that we embrace everybody, regardless of race, color, ethnicity, religion, culture, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, age. That's a great deal to put your arms around. And so it's very important that we make sure that the culture of the Rotary family at the smallest element, the club, embraces DEI. And so a lot of work has been done in that area. And then lastly, there is the Learning Center. And there, once again, is an enormous plethora of information in the Learning Center. It is staggering how much material there is. And very importantly, material, I beg your pardon, material germane to DEI has been incorporated into that learning center. And it's important that that material also be disability friendly in the sense of accessibility. And that's something I've been focusing on quite strongly, is to make sure that there is sufficient accessibility of the DEI material within the learning center. And I'll be ending now, Alison, as you'll be relieved. So I think it's very important that we need to put out there the message that one of the things we really strongly want, and the board has endorsed this, is that more and more people, not just incoming officers, but more and more people take advantage of the Learning Center and inform themselves through the very, very good material that there is on DEI. And so I'd like to sign off with one last thing, Alison, if you don't mind. And I say this to every club that I speak to, and I speak to a lot of clubs now on this issue, and particularly around disability inclusion, is we must never forget our mantra. Is it the truth? And then apply something of a DEI lens to it. But in my point of view, a disability lens. Is it the truth? Make sure that if something says it's accessible, that it genuinely is. If your club says that it's accessible, that it really is. So is it the truth? Secondly, is it fair to all concerned? How can it be fair if some people are going to be excluded through inaccessibility, for instance? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? How sad if some are excluded due to inaccessibility? And lastly, will it be beneficial to all concerned? Well, let's make sure by ensuring that we embrace the DEI mantra within Rotary. Thank you, Alison.
Thanks, Jeremy, for providing that context of how disability is being included into Rotary. Now we're going to pass it on to Victoria, who's a member of the Rotary Club of World Disability Advocacy, to talk about her personal experience.
Recording in progress.
Hi, can you put me back into the disability room?
Yeah, sure. You're in the disability room.
There you go. David, if you could mute. Or Victor, if you could mute David, so Victoria could go ahead.
Recording in progress.
And maybe, I think David maybe entered again, and just, it's really helpful if folks mute, not only from just a logistical, but as a significant accessibility issue. We'd really appreciate it. Go ahead, Victoria.
Okay, first, can everyone hear me? I want to make sure that my technical difficulties doesn't interfere with anyone else. Okay, so my name is Victoria Handy. I am a member of the Rotary Club, and I'm 29 years old. I'm an African-American woman. I reside here in Mississippi in the United States. I have brown eyes, dark brown, black hair, and very tan complexion. Just a few things about me. I am autistic. I have a BA in psychology from Tougaloo College, and I am just months away from receiving my master's from Capella University in ABA, or Applied Behavior Analyst. And I am currently a registered behavior technician and the only autistic one on staff. So they really count that as an inclusion and a just wonderful thing to have on faculty, since we work with a lot of autistic children. I wanted to come and speak today about my own personal experiences because, as Allison mentioned, they are my personal experiences, and they all too familiar relate to the issues that we face now with inclusion. But I also wanted to talk about that inclusion that really hits home to the African American population because, unfortunately, that's where the inclusion is pretty much less than zero. Um, I was diagnosed at the age of 17, unfortunately, because I had the only access to very not so great help and healthcare and mental health care. The first thing is that Mississippi is pretty much one of the lowest paid states and lowest funding states for mental health care, let alone developmental health care. And all those issues correlate to one another because the African American population is pretty much the 95% rate of the state of Mississippi. So just imagine how many children and even adults are getting late diagnosis of autism or late diagnosis of whatever they may have because we don't have the proper access to those resources or those health care. When I was 17 years old, to hear that I have autism, I was familiar with autism, but I had no idea what that meant for me and what my life would be like moving forward. When I was younger, I was misdiagnosed to the point where my counterparts who are non Black had a better chance of receiving treatment and help than I did. And it wasn't until, and I'm just going to be frank, I had to go completely to a different town and another part of the state for me to receive proper diagnoses by others who were non Black, so to speak, that really just brought it home for me as an adult. Like, okay, yes, I'm Black, but why did I have to go to a non Black area to receive proper health care, even on a proper diagnosis for my life, than I did surrounded by my own people? And that is just disheartening as an adult, even when I have accepted my diagnoses and I've come to terms with it and I've lived a very successful and full life. And unfortunately, even people in the African American community either do not understand it or they shy away from it. That's the realistic part of it. That's the reality of us as a people. Oftentimes, when I disclose for job searching, or maybe because I feel comfortable in saying, hey, yes, I have autism. These are the small accommodations I might need, but I'm still capable of doing the job. I am still capable of doing many things that you yourself can do. I often get shied away or job offers are backpedaled upon. It's like they really don't want to deal with someone who has a disability, but I like to look at my disability as a different ability. I don't like to use the word disabled for me personally because there's nothing about me that says, hey, you can't. There's everything that says you just have to do it differently, but you still can. And that's the message that I hope to, along with Rotary, to spread to the African American population. Autism is not completely fully understood, but it is being more widely accepted now. However, a lot of us in the African American community either don't know, don't show, or simply do not care about autism. And it's sad to say because we do feel, we actually do feel that, you know, it is an important factor that not only affects people of the African American community, they affect people of all races. This is something that should be brought together for all of us. It takes many colors to make a rainbow. And as Jeremy said, it's a lot of us that have disabilities and it transcends culture, ethnic boundaries. It transcends a lot of those. So, to be fair, if you disregard one person with a disability, then you're practically essentially disregarding everybody that has a disability. Sometimes the I do not like it when they have on those forms, do you suffer from this disorder or that disorder, because a lot of employment opportunities, they kind of just use that as a filter. Like they want you to disclose. So when you do disclose, they either can say, oh, well, we found someone better for the job, or we found somebody better suited for this. But the very real fact is they thought that you couldn't do the job, or you were going to be a liability because of your disability. And I have experienced in my time so many good job opportunities that were taken from me because of false assumptions rather than asking a question or asking multiple questions. I really am a very direct and honest person, and I will be honest about my limitations if necessary. But the main thing that I think for the African American community is it's very important to start one being aware that there are disabilities out there that does not interfere with a person's intellectual or ability to handle a job or ability to even have a good life like anybody else. And two, start becoming more aware of what certain things are. If you're aware of it being in existence, you should want to have the initial the initial way of saying, I want to know more about this, because tomorrow it could be your own child that could be diagnosed. It could be, you who could be diagnosed. So I think if you take those into account, that will make it much better for someone down the road, because you'd be surprised how many times I disclose and someone would say, oh, well, that's okay. I have an uncle, I have a nephew, I have a granddaughter, I have someone that I know who has autism too. And it's just absolutely a beautiful thing to see that I inspire so many people and essentially crush a lot of the myths that happen to come up about autism. And I also have done a few blogs with the Autism Speaks Foundation. I have done a few little events with them as well. I have been asked to speak in other events as well, just giving my take on what it's like for an actual autistic person that is an African American. One of the biggest things that I want to leave is one of the biggest things that I want to leave with everyone is don't discount a person because of limitations. Because with limitations, they may have one limit in box A, but a ton of potential in box B. And if you discount one little limitation in box A, then you're throwing away a ton of potential in box B because of something that you can't see. I have had those experiences as well. I see minute details that people, like 30,000 people, can overlook. But those same 30,000 people might say, well, you didn't see what we see, so we're not sure if you can. And I really do not use the word can't, because I have autism and I have maintained an A average in my graduate program. And even some professors are just absolutely just in awe, because there are classes I have had perfect scores in. And even my own parents are like, how did you? And I'm like, I don't know how I do it. I just do it. I never use the word can't. I may have difficulty in some things. I may have obstacles in some things, but I never say I cannot do it. I might say I'm unable to. I might need accommodations. I might need to adjust it this way, but I'd never use the word can't. And I think that's the biggest thing that is thrust upon us. We are constantly told we can't do something. We're constantly told I can't be a part of something. We're told no in so many facets that sometimes we start to believe that. And I want to change the playing field a bit by telling people, first off, you can, and first off, we need to, because we need this for many other people who are like this. And is the more that we shine our light, I think the more that we kind of just, push all the criticism and the assumptions aside, that
Thanks,
this is
Victoria,
possible.
for all that
Thank you.
information. Thanks. And now we'll hear from Nate. And if folks want to put questions in the chat, we can respond to those after Nate speaks.
Hi, yes, so thank you for the invite. As I said, I'm from the Ethel Orange Rotary Club in Massachusetts, and I was asked to talk a little bit about physical accessibility today. So I like to point out that physical disability can often be simpler than people initially think it is. You know, there's obvious things like a wheelchair ramp that people need if it's able to if you're able to meet in a place with a button that for the door opener, that's ideal. I also and there's different views on this, but I also like to point out that you know, if you're in a place uh that doesn't have a door opener, it is an opportunity for one of um the fellow Rotarians to help their member get in the door if they need help with it. Um, it's some other things that might seem obvious to some but not to others. Just to have a table that's high enough for a person in a wheelchair to drive under, to have chairs that are movable, so that somebody can park their wheelchair. Um, this all kind of leads me to point out that oftentimes in society, it is the other speakers have been saying, the bigger barrier is attitudinal, the attitudes around in society. And to be honest, I find myself you know, I'm a social worker by trade, and I find myself devaluing other people with disabilities in some ways, and I try to be honest about it and recognize it when it happens. So it's just kind of an ongoing challenge for us all to recognize that reality that Jeremy and Victoria were talking about, and see if we can learn from each other to be as inclusive as possible. And my club often has a place with where food is served. We have a meeting where food is served, and likewise, it's if it's not at a restaurant, it's better to have the food at a you know, at a table height where the person can pick out the food themselves. If not, again, it's my club used to meet before COVID at a hospital. If where it was kind of a conference room, and the food wasn't in a physical place that I could get at it. So one of my fellow Rotarians would assist me, which was great. Now we meet at a restaurant, so it's not so much of an issue. And one other thing I'd just like to point out about uh mindsets is that we know there are some clubs, I believe, still in the Massachusetts district that do meet in places that aren't wheelchair accessible. So, you know, if any of us on the call are aware of this, we'd like those people to really see what they're missing out on not being inclusive, and consider that and contact the World Disability Advocates to get some advice on how to handle it. Unfortunately, you know, not being as inclusive can be very traditional. So it can kind of force people out of their comfort zone sometimes, even to meet somewhere else. Likewise, during COVID, because of my medical situation, I've been using Zoom a lot. As COVID opens back, as the world opens back up, I just like to point out that it should always be that at least in my opinion, that Zoom is an option, but it shouldn't be the only way a person with a disability can participate. If they wanted to participate in the live meeting, of course, it's best to have that option. And as I say, I think as a society we should fight for equal rights and recognize, injustice when it's there, but also be easy on ourselves. I've been unaware sometimes of the way people with certain disabilities need assistance. So it's all about educating ourselves and getting better, being as inclusive as possible. And that's all I have to say for today. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Nate. If folks want to raise their virtual hand or put in the chat that they'd like to ask a question, we can take those. And while we're waiting for those, I just want to kind of talk about the three presentations and highlight some things that, when thinking about access, not only for Rotary, but outside of Rotary. And, I think the four of us also highlight the diversity within disability in and of itself, and experiences can be really different. Nate highlighted accommodations, accessible meeting places, and I always talk about thinking about access before someone asks for an accommodation. I think I mentioned this in another conversation about, people with disabilities are pretty savvy. We come with a lot of strategies to accommodate, to have to just live our life. So if you're having, some sort of community event, don't wait for a person with a disability to say they're going to attend before making it accessible. Because if we see if it's in a place that's inaccessible, or if we see that your videos aren't captioned or things, or if there's not an accessible format to documents or your website, that before you even have an interaction with us, that's going to look like not a welcoming invitation for us. I also think about the importance of how improved access benefits everyone. We talk about this as the curb cut effect. So when things are made accessible from the get-go, they also, benefit other people. So documents in plain language, elevators, captioning, have benefits to the entire community. So, the most common example is curb cuts that benefit, parents with strollers and people, delivery drivers who need to access a building, things like that. And also asking people with disabilities what they need, not assuming that two people with the same disability need the same accommodation. Is there anything else that the panelists want to highlight? And I have a document that kind of highlights these things that I can put in the chat as well. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Thank you. I just had a thought, and you mentioned it briefly, but there's a term called universal access. And exactly what you said just now is universal access benefits everybody. It's not just about, in the old days, we used to think about providing accessibility features for people with disabilities, which are invariably tack-ons or add-ons into buildings and things. And universal access has a very wide scope, and it benefits everybody. Everybody benefits from a gentle ramp into an area rather than steps. Everybody likes a nice light mall. Everybody prefers larger font, for instance, than tiny font. And so there are many aspects of, in fact, universally accessible websites are easier to use than many very busy, very noisy websites, as an example. All these things are examples of universal access. And the thing is that disability has been viewed as something of a troublemaker and as a bit of a pest, actually, because we tend to put our hands up at inconvenient moments and say, well, we can't actually. And so there needs to be a level of more inclusive mindedness around, and viewing disability in a different paradigm is actually essential here, where you consider disability as like everybody else. And there's a very simple rule of thumb there. What would you expect from your Rotary Club, your district, your town, your city, if it was you? Because there's something you must remember, is that there is nothing one can do about acquiring a disability tomorrow. That is a reality. Disability is something that happens to everybody at some point, and certainly when you get older. And so just think about it. What would I expect if it was me? If you encounter some difficulties around decision-making, around around people with disabilities being able to access various aspects of your club or your district. Thank you, Alison.
Nate or Victoria, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I do want to highlight one thing. As Nate touched on, it's attitudinal. Oftentimes, you find that when you have someone that is close to you that suffers from a disability, you also find sometimes that some people, if they're not related to you, their attitude on that same disability changes because you're not related to them in any way. It's like the attitude changes from more understanding when it's someone that you know or you're related to, and it changes to a very negative aspect when it's someone that you don't know. And in the African American population, that happens, but in all population, that happens as well. So that's one intersectionality that I just wanted to highlight again. It's very important that we all become a team and a family, because essentially we all have different disabilities, but we are still struggling with our disabilities, and that makes us a family. So the important thing to remember is, yes, it affects the African American population a little bit more so, but it still affects other populations as well. So I think Rotary is a good way of transcending those and becoming one to push the boundaries and telling people in multiple ways that disability is a very real thing, of course, and we need, certain accommodations, or we need support. So that's one thing that I think would have helped me if I could go back and talk to my 17-year-old self, and of course, getting rid of a lot of myths that come with having a disability. So with that being said, I'll thank you all for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Allison.
Thanks, Victoria. I just want to highlight a comment that David put in the chat about terminology and language. And one of the things going back to asking, we started out with explaining our disabilities, and also within the disability community in itself, you're thinking about a very broad and diverse group. So there's different ways that people explain their disability or reference themselves. For example, in the disability community right now, there's a conversation about what's considered identity first or person with first language. So I might say I'm a dwarf, which is more of an identity first language example or I'm a person with dwarfism. And part of that comes from a lot of different conversations and thoughts around how, disability is very much a part of people's identities, but also that aspect of it's not just one identity for a person. So, and I can put some resources in the chat that, there's kind of that conversation, but then there's also a lot of conversation about some really offensive terms. And there's style guides as well around what kind of do's and don'ts and what to avoid. Does anybody on the panel have anything more on terminology to mention?
I do have one quick statement. When I was diagnosed with autism, at the time, it was known as Asperger's syndrome. And for those that may not be aware, when the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, the 5th edition, was published, Asperger's had been grouped into the autism category. So it's still known as autism. Usually when I tell people that I have autism, some may ask me, well, are you an Aspie? Which is short for a person who has Asperger's syndrome. They call them Aspies. And I tell them, while yes, that is my diagnosis, and yes, I do have autism, please try not to say that I have, that I struggle with this disorder. Yes, I have struggles, but there's a way in saying it to, oh, you struggle with it like it's just a curse, or you have struggles with it. Yes, I have struggles with it, but I'm not struggling with it. There's that confusion there, and I often clear that up from time to time, but we are in the process. I am working with other people with the same disorders and processing them to be more convenient on the language and the terminology.
Thanks.